Have you ever gained weight while training for a race or an endurance event and you want to know why it happens and how to prevent it the next time? That's exactly what we're going to dive into today's episode. Hello there, my friends, and welcome back to my podcast / the Doc Lyss Fitness YouTube. And today we're talking weight gain while racing or training for big endurance events. Now, this is something that comes up a lot, and I think it's something worth addressing here on a podcast or video format where you can opt in or out of this conversation based off your own discretion and how you feel about weight loss or body recomposition talks or conversations around these things. So typically, I tend to avoid conversations around changing your body weight and or fat loss, not because I'm against it. Actually, my PhD is in fat metabolism, but because my page and my training and everything I do is so performance driven that I really like exercise focused on performance outcomes and goals. It's something that excites me more training and coaching wise, but I also recognize that people have body composition goals. People do struggle with fat loss or desiring it and wanting to know effective, evidence-based and smart practical ways to approach that. Or we are not going to escape this in the industry, and I'd rather you get good information from someone like me who has a PhD in exercise physiology as well as fat metabolism and energy substrate use during exercise training in your diet than maybe some cortisol hormone coach that's making you afraid to ever train for an endurance event ever again, telling you that the running alone is the thing that's making you fat. So let's dive in here today with a disclaimer that if this conversation isn't for you, it's okay to take a swift exit right now out of this podcast or YouTube videos. I have tons of other content to dive in, and if it is something that you are curious about, let's get started. So when you are training for a race or an event, what I see a lot of people have happen is they train for it and they either want to use it as a diet plan or they expect that the outcome would be fat loss because they're training more. And what they end up seeing is that they either don't lose any weight at all or they gain weight in the process of it. Or maybe they lost weight the first time they trained for something, but the next time they gain weight and they feel really frustrated and they say, well, the running or the endurance training alone is what made me fat, or those are the things that caused me to, spike my cortisol and hold on to the belly fat and all those things that people are claiming. And really, the unfortunate reality is that it does come down to nutrition. Now, there's going to be more to this conversation that I think is worth going back and listening to after you're done with this episode, or even before you finish the rest of this episode. My performance versus aesthetics video or podcast episode, that is one of my most popular episodes or videos because I know it's a topic that people want to learn more about, and it talks about that balance of training for performance versus training for aesthetics and kind of marrying those two a little bit more. And today I'm going to make that conversation a little more specific to training for a race and an event. So the reality is when you are training for a race, whether that's, your first half marathon, your first ultra, your first big endurance thing, big is relative to you and your fitness level, right? And you need to approach this with not the mindset of one, using it as a diet tool. It's not a time to diet. It's not a time to be in an energy deficit. It's not a time to use this as your cut. Focusing on training as your time to train, right? If you want to lose weight or body recomp, save that goal for outside of that time period. So, I think there's a lot of people who are going to try to dance around and say, well, you can lose weight while you're doing these things. And potentially, if you're adding in some running, general running, cardio, you've never been running before, once you adapt and maintain to that, sure, yeah, maybe you can. It's not that you can never run and be in an energy deficit at the same period of time, but it's that if you're training for a specific goal or race or event, I'm of the stance of let's use that time period to focus on that goal. So my advice is going to be more in alignment of not how to lose weight while you're training for a race or event. This doesn't mean if you lose weight or recomp a little bit, that's a bad thing. I am someone who I know when I'm training for big races, my ultra marathons, things like that, I do tend to lean out a little bit, but within a normal parameter of my body weight fluctuations, I'm not massively cutting or losing a ton of weight in a way that is of concern. And so when you're training for these races events, you need to start approaching them with a training, diet, fueling mindset, not a diet industry mindset and applying it to your training. I think the biggest mistake most people make is they take all the things they've learned about dieting or nutrition from like a diet-focused, diet industry-focused view and apply that then to their training or their racing. And then they don't feel fueled, or they're, spinning their wheels, or they feel really hungry, or they don't understand how to adjust either their food intake or macronutrients in a way that can help both support performance and mitigate some of that excess hunger that tends to be what leads us to overeat, which tends to lead to increased body fat or gaining weight or whatever that is with our training. And so you need to first start thinking of yourself as a little bit more of an athletic view of nutrition and training and fueling. Now, I have a guide, my Fast and Fed guide, that I think would be really helpful. We can link that in the show notes here below. I also have a free macro calculator that you can use to kind of help you get started on navigating this. I personally really like the Macro Factor app. Not sponsored. They did give me a free membership years ago, but I have been using it since 2020. I genuinely love that app, and I think it's a great way to kind of self-coach yourself through these things if you aren't looking to do a coach. And then if you are looking to do coaching, me and the Lyss Method have recently partnered with Hard House Nutrition, and that is our go-to nutrition rec here if you are just looking for resources on doing this for yourself, outside of this here today. And so when you're doing that, you need to start thinking about yourself as, how do I eat to fuel my performance, right? And eating to fuel your performance means eating enough, not under eating, not restricting, and not, trying to white knuckle your dieting approach while training for that race. That itself is going to just lead into even more increased or inflated hunger than if you just ate enough and kind of learn to mitigate or manage your hunger within that. And so the first thing that we want to think about that I think so many people neglect when it comes to you either gaining weight or becoming skinny fat or having poor body composition changes or whatever you want to use for the label of it when training for a race or an event is protein intake. I think so many people make the mistake of not thinking that they need moderate to high protein intake as a runner or an endurance athlete or someone who's training for a running or endurance event, because that's for the meatheads, that's for the bros, that's for the lifters. And I'm here to tell you that the nutritional intake guidance and recommendation for people who do endurance training is pretty similar, if not sometimes more than that, of those who do strength training, or especially those that do mixed training. And most of you in my audience here, hopefully resistance training or high rep training in conjunction with your race training goals. And so this is especially true if you are doing that. If you are strength training on top of these things and or maintaining that with it, you definitely want to keep your protein intake up. So I will recommend here 1.6 to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight per day, 1.6 being the lower end. And we actually are starting to get a little bit more evidence out there. There's been some great reviews by Stronger by Science on this recently as well, saying that 1.6 recommendation that a lot of us have been kind of falling back on might actually be higher than we think. And I'm actually increasing my own protein intake in response to this new data. To be transparent here, I've been around that 1.6 pretty consistently, give or take, higher, lower days for a while now throughout my training. I have maintained a lot of muscle and performance and recovery very well with it, but I am experimenting with bumping that back up. And so that is something that I transparently would be working on with you guys here as well. And so I think that, one, that will help you maintain muscle mass, and maintaining muscle mass will help you maintain body composition or that toned or lean or athletic or fit look that you're looking for. So you want to be making sure that you're getting that protein intake in the whole day. But typically I do recommend spacing that across your meals, trying to get, 30 grams, get 20 to 30, maybe 20 to 40, depending on how much your intake is per day. Up to 50 maybe for my taller, larger, maybe male friends here listening to this. And so getting that in, especially at breakfast, especially around your workouts, you don't have to have this like perfect pre and post workout timed protein intake, but I do recommend just like spacing it across your day, having that stimulus across your day for maintaining recovery, muscle protein synthesis, muscle, and or just repairing and recovering from your runs. Running is damaging and fatiguing on your body. I think a lot of people think that only muscle is broken down by lifting, and it is broken down by running. One of the most classic models of muscle breakdown in exercise physiology research is centric downhill running. So we want to make sure that we're getting in protein intake to support that. So again, I think 1.6 to 2.0 grams per kilogram, that's like roughly around 0.8 to 1 grams per pound of body weight per day. And so the question that always comes along with this protein intake recommendation is like, what if I have, excess adipose tissue, I have a little bit more body fat, how should I adjust this? And so, kind of thinking about what is your lean mass, if you know that from a DEXA, even a rough, not perfect in-body could be fine here as well. And getting in like 1 gram per pound of lean mass, or like 2 grams per pound of kilograms, or 2 grams per kilo of lean mass is a good rough estimate there. Estimated if you kind of can get a rough idea of your body comp, or just like a lot of people like to use like ideal body weight. I don't like ideal body weight because I think sometimes people have a different idea of what ideal body weight for them is versus what it is for their body, but neither here nor there. You can kind of do the math and apply it to either lean mass or, eat based off of like ideal body weight grams per that. So if you are someone who's, say, for example, 200 pounds and you know that you have maybe a higher body composition, maybe you're eating closer to like 150. For example, you're not eating 200 grams per pound of body weight per day, et cetera, et cetera. So you can kind of adjust and titrate that. And my macro calculator does account for that and ask you guys questions to filter that out for you for kind of setting and guiding that for yourself. But if you can't jump to those amounts right away, just start with where you can. I think that 1.6 as a minimum is a really good place to be. And so with that, I'm also going to add here This is a podcast about more so nutrition and body composition, but we cannot talk about maintaining body composition or maintaining that athletic, lean, tone, whatever categorization we like to apply to it here without saying that, like, if you want to maintain that look of that or maintaining a solid body composition or, athletic look while running, you should be lifting while running or endurance training. I think a lot of people make that mistake. And yeah, you are going to probably lose muscle and or not gain muscle, which is really important for metabolic health, maintaining, your metabolism, boosting and firing it, as the kids like to say on the streets of social media. And or it is the largest contributor to our resting energy metabolism every single day. Just because a lot of muscle doesn't add a ton to that, it is costly to build and maintain muscle, and or it's going to give you that shape and look of what a lot of people are often looking for, and it will help boost your running performance and or support that. So we really want to be doing that anyway, and I definitely have some other podcast episodes and YouTube videos talking more about maintaining muscle and strength while also concurrently training for race or endurance training, or we can help you with that in the Lyss method, my training programs, which we'll link below as well. But that with the protein intake will do a lot of maintaining that body composition that you're looking for, or helping kind of reduce or delay or prevent excess adiposity gained through this process of training. It's not a cure-all. It's not 100%. Like if you eat a ton of protein and lift, you won't gain a single pound while race training, but that is going to be a large piece of the puzzle there, is making sure that you are supporting, maintaining, or building muscle in the process of doing that, and or giving your body what it needs to recover. Protein also does a lot for satiety, maintaining hunger. It will also help you not have that super, worn out, I'm not recovered, flat feeling that I feel like on those days I do end up eating a lot more. Carbs play a role in that. We'll talk about that here in a second as well. But, protein is beating a dead horse. Everyone knows they should be eating a lot of protein, but, that is a huge piece of the puzzle here, and pairing that with resistance training. So that's why I'm going to start with that. The next thing is going to be eating enough carbs and treating carbs as if you have performance goals. And so a lot of people are afraid of carbs, or carbs are the boogeyman, carbs are the bad guy on the street, should we be keto, carnivore, low carb, all that stuff. At this point in time, the data for, low carb performance is just not there. It's not supported. It isn't strong. You're going to do better with carbs, and also the carbs are protein sparing. So if you eat enough carbs, or the more carbs you have, the more it's going to spare protein breakdown, or your body won't be breaking down proteins into essentially amino acid skeletons that then get turned into the energy metabolism cycle. In this place of carbohydrates, which can come from your muscle or your protein that you're getting in that you want to be using for rebuilding and regenerating tissue. So again, carbs are really important for that, but also I think people really underplay the value and role that carbs have in not just their recovery in response to or during cardiovascular training sessions or endurance training, but also managing your hunger and satiety with race training. One of the main reasons that so many people have such an increased hunger in response to race or endurance training is that you have low blood sugar, your muscle glycogen stores are lower, and or you're not eating enough carbs for recovery, because you're not just using carbs when you are physically during your training sessions, but you're also using them for energy metabolism, for recovery and repair in response to your training session. And so endurance training, cardiovascular training depletes your muscle glycogen stores, essentially your little carb stores in your muscles, far more than resistance training does. And then of course, if you're doing both, then you are getting it depleted. But a long enough running or a high enough intense running session can 100% deplete your carbohydrate stores, and or, your going to need to replace and replenish that, but then also keep fueling that, so it keeps replacing and replenishing that, or using it for your recovery and repair in response to that training. So I think people really underestimate this, and I think everything that they eat that is carbohydrate is just going into their body to be stored as fat. But first, you're going to refill those carbohydrate stores in your muscle, and then you're going to use the rest of that to store or put into your storing your liver, or potentially fat, and sometimes it gets stored into fat and then re-released later to be used in energy metabolism. But typically your body isn't just going to go out of its way to store carbs as fat or fats as carbs. It's going to kind of use things preferentially and shift towards what's available in the moment. And typically if you've done an endurance training session or a high intensity cardio day or whatever it is, your body is going to be using that carbohydrate to replenish, repair, and restore more than just immediately turning it into fat. But when you have low blood sugar or low glycogen stores, which when your glycogen stores are low, they're going to start pulling all the carbs that they can from your bloodstream, which will then make your blood sugar low, which will make you hangry, or that I'm going to walk in the grocery store and buy and eat everything, or that uncontrolled hunger feeling that a lot of people tend to have. And so when you eat enough carbs, you have adequate carbohydrate balance for your activity level, right? Like the more you are active, the more your carbohydrate needs are. It's not that I'm saying everyone needs to be having like 300, 400, 500 grams of carbs a day. It's that the more active you are, the more your carbohydrates needs are going to be. And that amount will depend on you. It's going to, there's a multiplication factor for grams of kilograms of body weight per day based off hours per week that you're training. And again, my macro calculator just does this for you, and I'll link that here below. And so essentially you want to preferentially favor carbs in your diet when you're training for these things. You want to be making sure that you're eating enough carbs and only support the hours of training that you're doing, your performance needs, but also that will help maintain some of that satiety and hunger that you're having. I think so many people do not realize that unsatiable hunger that you are having in response to your running training is often coming from the fact that you do not have enough carbohydrate and your body is hungry and it's wanting to replace and replenish that, or your blood sugar is low. And then what happens when you have that low energy state, your blood sugar is low, especially if you're coming off of a long run or a long training, session where you didn't eat enough carbs either before or during, if it was necessary to eat it during, is that you're going to reach for more hyperpalatable, more calorically dense, and or have more of a hedonic response where you start to overeat in response to that training because of your body's response to that. If you go into your training sessions well fed with enough carbs, you eat enough carbs during your inter-run nutrition and fueling during that, you will often find that you will leave those training sessions not feeling that hangry, low blood sugar, hunger monster, and you'll be able to actually kind of eat more responsibly in, response to that. I don't want to say that like eating a lot because you're super hungry is irresponsible, but you'll have more of a reasonable, normal, hunger and satiety response to that. You won't have this like hyper, like, oh my gosh, I'm going to inhale a bag of chips or a whatever is in front of me or whatever that looks like. And trust me, I have been there. Trust me when I say I have been there, but I've been fed before and I see how much easier it is for me to come home and eat more of a well-balanced meal in response to my training session when I went into it fed and was well fed during it. And so that will help curb off or reduce that hunger response. But what you need to do in response to that, or the opposite of that, is titrate down fats potentially. I think that I talked about this a little bit more in my Performance versus Aesthetics podcast. And so bear with me and try to follow me here on this. So a lot of times when people are talking about nutrition, they will say, keep calories and protein and then like let fats and carbs fall where they may. And that is great advice for regular people who are just trying to eat nutrition in a way that they're not being like a slave to macro counting. And I'm not saying that you need to be like hitting grams to the point every single day within this. So people don't realize that they choose carbohydrate-based foods that they think are primarily carbohydrate, are mostly carbohydrate, but they also have a lot of fat in them. And this isn't me saying fats are bad. You should not be eating fats. You should reducing, avoiding it. You should eat adequate fats in your diet from good fat choices during your training. This is not me saying that at all. But what I'm saying is that when you reach for the full fat, full cream cheese, mac and cheese, the pasta dishes, the muffins, the pastries, the donuts, the things like that are kind of more mixed macros than they are just carbohydrates, what we end up doing is not meeting our carbohydrate needs of what we actually need to support our goals. And then we're eating more fat. And that fat is calorically dense. Again, I'm not here to make people afraid of calories, but you are then potentially not meeting that need of carbohydrate that your body is looking for from a hunger, satiety, recovery, replenishment standpoint. And you are meeting your calorie needs, though, that you need based off your training goals from the fat intake. And so what ends up happening is a lot of people end up inadvertently or unintentionally eating more calories because they're eating more things that are more mixed macro and driving that up with the fat calories in order to kind of meet that carb need or carb signal or hunger signal that their body is creating for them. Of course, protein can help manage this a little bit too if you are not eating enough protein or really slacking or reducing that. But assuming you're eating like enough protein, relative to what you're doing, I find that, a lot of people underestimate how much they need of carbohydrate and then how much that hunger signal will essentially override what they think they're meeting by eating enough calories in general. And so I've done this before in the past. I've done this training for races where I am gaining weight, I'm eating a ton, but I also am bonking or not feeling recovered or having that low blood sugar response all the time. And so this isn't just something that's advice for just like managing your calorie intake and hunger, but also making sure that you're getting what you need for performance, right? Because if you are eating way too high of fat, and even if your calories are fine, your calories are where they need to be. Say you need to be eating like 2,700 calories per day to meet your caloric needs from your training. There's a big difference in how you're going to feel recovery-wise, performance-wise, training, in response to training, et cetera, if you are doing, say, 40% fat and, oh my gosh, I can't do math in my head, and then, 20% protein and then 40% carbs versus 20% fat, 20% protein and 60% carbs, or 30% fat, 20% protein, 50% carbs. And so there's going to be a difference there, even under the same caloric intake and same caloric conditions, as if you bump up that ratio of carbohydrate to everything else that you're doing there. And so I'm not saying that you should take your fats super low. I really don't recommend that people take their fats typically lower than 20% of their dietary intake. For me, I favor fats. I love fats. I struggle with this. I'm rarely under 25 to 30% of my diet coming from fat. So I'm not saying to like go super abstain, avoid eggs and avocado and nut butters or whatever it is that you're getting from your fat sources. Fats are important for health. They are important for hormones. They're important for our overall well-being, satiety. They help with, bringing in fat soluble vitamins from we get from our diet. This is not me saying to fear fat and go back to like, the early 90s, 2000s fads of fearing and avoiding eggs or whatever that is. It's saying that we need to make sure that we are adjusting our macronutrient intake more strategically and more appropriately to the task at hand. So personally, my carb intake gets really high when I am training for races and events. And something that I do in my off season when I'm recovering and or pulling back the volume of endurance training is I let myself flip that a little bit. I let my fat intake go up a little bit higher, and or I let myself enjoy more fatty foods or higher fat ratio in my diet within this, my new calories based off what I need in response to training, because my palate is kind of sick of all the carbs all the time, or I want to break from it, or I personally like a lot of fats, or it's not that important. I'm getting in enough carbs to support, my off-season training volume as is. So it's not to say you can't ever have like a high-fat meal ever again or anything like that. It's that we just need to be more appropriate with that, because I truly believe if more people took a more dialed in approach to their nutrition when they are training for racing events, they would realize that they would have a lot better body composition through it. Yes, that will help with, not having excess unnecessary, quote unquote, that you describe yourself, weight loss or any of those things, but it will also help with your performance goals. So a lot of this advice here isn't just to say, this is how you can be your thinnest, skinniest runner on, for your next 5K or half marathon. It's that this advice is also good, practical, sound training advice. And that's why I said you need to start taking a training view or training and performance fueled mindset to these training goals, and not just a diet industry mindset that's just either restricting everything or, protein is fine and calories are fine, so everything else is okay. You do need to start shifting a little bit of that focus to be more primarily focused on carbs. Now, if you are someone who's like just adding in running, you're a beginner runner, maybe you're training for your first 5K, this advice might not be as like super dialed in necessary for you. But, for my friends that are starting to train for events that they're running for 5, 7, 8, 9, 10 hours a week for, those half marathons, ultra marathon goals, that's when this stuff really, I think, starts to come into play a lot more. You can kind of get away. You're probably eating enough carbs within nutritional parameters in your diet for your 5K, 10K, beginning runner, fun, recreational goals. But as you start to have these increased recovery, repair, high volume training sessions, high intensity training sessions, you're constantly depleting your glycogen stores or you're not meeting that with dietary needs alone, or you're having to fuel within your workouts. That's when you just need to kind of shift that focus on this. And so that's not to say you will never gain weight while race training. Sometimes you might need to gain weight. You might have been under eating or too thin for what was necessary for, hormonal or menstrual cycle or regular health with training, and having to bump that up and carry a little bit more fat. That's not to say that there's never a case in point in time to have or gain a little bit more weight. You might just need more fuel or extra fuel, and that might be the response that your body has, in response to the training needs and the hunger that you have. But this should kind of keep that within like a regular parameters of your own body fluctuations or the range of weight that your body kind of typically sits in. Training for a marathon shouldn't having you gaining like an incredibly excess amount of weight. A few pounds here or there, a little bit of extra weight, that's sometimes just part of the process of fueling for what you're doing. But this is something that I think will not only help with kind of answering that question, the age-old question of like, why am I gaining weight when I'm training for my race? But also help you feel better and perform better and feel better. And all those things together will also help support your body composition. So, to kind of recap here, if you're eating within a caloric range, adequate protein, your resistance training to complement and support your training for maintaining muscle mass or, helping performance as well. And then eating enough carbs based off of your activity levels and demands, and making sure that that matches the volume of training that you're doing. I think you will be so surprised by how many carbs that you actually need from the volume of training that you're doing, and kind of shifting more to a diet that favors carbohydrates. So you have enough of that, which will help maintain satiety, hunger, improve performance, and or, your training outcomes along the way. And then just either pulling back or keeping fats within a certain parameter, roughly 20 to 30% of your nutrition composition. And then the last thing that I'll add to this that we didn't talk about here is just like eating enough calories in general. So I know people don't like percentages, because if I say eating at least 20 to 30% of your diet from fat and you're eating 1,100 calories, that's going to be like pretty low, right? Comparatively. But for most of you who have performance and training goals, you will have to increase your caloric intake, but there's this fine line of like, you have to increase your caloric intake to some degree as you increase training volume. But like, I think people who increase their training volume just a little bit at the lower end of the spectrum of physical activity think that they need a massive amount of calories, and you really don't. It's a little bit because there is some compensation. Essentially, as you increase physical activity, it's not additive. You don't just add calories as you burn them. There is a compensation that happens from your body, where essentially you end up moving less indirectly. You have less NEAT, you're less, spontaneous physical activity, twitching, fidgeting, all that stuff, because your body is expending so much more or wanting to pull back to conserve for recovery. And so the additive effect isn't as much as you think, but as you increase more and more and more, there is going to be an additive effect as you do a lot more training. I need to eat a lot more food when I'm training for an ultra marathon than I do right now, where I'm kind of doing like 4 45 minutes lifts per week and like 4 to 5 cardio sessions. I'm eating a lot more of like a normal amount of food for me, like a regular amount of food, where my caloric intake when I'm training for those big races or events, or how it was this past year when I was doing that, was somewhere, like 4, 5, 6, 7, 800, 1,000 sometimes calories more per day in response to my training. So it needs to match the goals of what you're doing, but you need to make sure you're also eating enough, because if you're under eating or restricting on top of training, the next time you see something that tastes good, you're going to go absolutely hog wild in response to that. It's a lot better to have a normal amount of nutrition intake across the week and have that more regular and or building in eating enough through your whole week than this restrict and overeat type cycle. But I will say, something that I think gets left out of the conversation when it comes to performance nutrition is not calorie cycling in the sense of like you have high days and low days, but rather you have regular days and then you have higher eating days. And so this is something that I think a lot of people think of the inverse. They think, well, I'm resting or I'm recovering or I'm training less, so I should eat less. But I want you instead to think of it as I'm eating my normal amount on the days that I'm training a normal. So say for you, your normal amount of training volume is like an hour a day, whether that's lifting or running or both in a single day, and you train say 6 days a week. But on 2 of those days, you either do a long run or a double day. So say your double day is on Tuesday and your long run's on Saturday. And on those days, you're doing closer to maybe say 2 hours of physical activity. You're doing a lot more volume. It's a lot more fatiguing. Maybe it's your speed workout, your long run. It's more high intense. On those days, you are going to probably want to bump up your caloric intake in response to that excess volume of training, with a large bit of that coming from carbohydrate. You will have a higher carb or a higher calorie day on those days of training, because if you try to eat your same regular amount of food the whole week across that, on these days that you're doing higher volume training, you do want to consider bumping up your calories or bumping up your carbohydrates in response to that training. And it's not that the other days are less, it's that you have higher recovery needs, higher nutritional needs, and or you're going to feel like a ravenous, crazy monster if you do not eat enough in response to that training and or the stimulus that you are giving your body. And this is all about not just maintaining your hunger and keeping it under control, but also to manage your recovery and repair that you need in response to that training. Because remember, the goal here isn't to diet or go into an energy deficit or be in a cut while you are training for these races. It's about keeping your nutrition kind of more dialed in and more in check, so to speak, but making sure that it is enough to support the training of what you're doing. So this isn't advice to be like in an energy deficit. This is to be kind of at an energy maintenance and or meeting the fluctuations of the caloric needs as they change across the week in response to the goals or the training sessions that you are doing. And so this is going to be my best advice for you all and kind of reducing that impact of training or endurance training or race training on like excess body weight, with keeping in mind that, sometimes we gain a little bit of weight while we're race training, and or, the easiest way to do this I found personally is tracking, but not everyone wants to track, but making sure you have high protein, high carb focused performance plates. A lot of my RD nutrition friends call them that. You don't have to track to do these things. You just have to be more aware of what you're eating. You probably can't just willy-nilly eat whatever you want. You have to think about it a little bit. Personally, that's why I like tracking, because it kind of removes me having to think so much. I just kind of am eating to the needs that I have. And I'm going to record another podcast episode on how I use tracking as a tool, rather than like being super specific with it, to build off this conversation here. But all that to say, we're just going to have to be a little bit more intentional. And that's how we are, right? When we're training anyway. When I'm training for a race, I'm more intentional about my training. I'm more intentional about my programming. I'm more intentional about like little details. I feel like in the off season or rest or recovery or between big racing events is when I let myself kind of be a little bit more human and pull back from that, so I mentally can get a break from it. But things need to be dialed in if you have these goals, and you don't need to all train, eat, sleep, perform like elite athletes here, but just start giving yourself a little bit more of that consideration of like, I'm someone with a performance goal. You will feel, recover, perform just a lot better if you approach these things this way. And something else I'll add here before we wrap up is like, don't neglect, food density, fiber, volume from plants like vegetables and or fruit. I think a lot of people, you end up, because you're training a lot, you just end up reaching for a lot of like easy, quick, convenience things, which are fine. But I find for me, when my hunger is higher with training, that doesn't mean I just get to have a free for all, eat whatever I want. I still have to have pretty dense meals that have a pretty good bit of a lot of fruit or a big salad or a lot of like starchy potatoes or starchy carbs or fibrous vegetables is part of that, to make sure I'm getting pretty high volume meals. Because when I'm training for these things, my hunger, I am digesting food so quickly. So if I lived my entire day on just like bagels and toast and protein shakes, I would be absolutely ravenous and starving. And so that is the only little bit of advice that you can take from like dieting, fitness, Instagram, social media type tips and apply to your training, is like making sure that if you need to stay full between meals or in response to that, or stay full for your sessions, like of course don't have a huge fiber bomb meal before you go for a 6-mile run or whatever it is, but making sure that you are still having like plant forward, high protein, like filling meals to meet your needs and your goals. There is going to be a time and a place where I'm absolutely relying on smoothies, shakes, juices, calorically dense, low volume things to meet my caloric needs for my day. That absolutely does happen. But I find that some of the best advice I can give you is still keep your meals as meals. Keep them filling, keep them being very protein focused, having enough fat up there, and then just increasing that carbohydrate portion of them, but not, only making that carbohydrate portion just simple carbs, which you are likely going to increase with training volume, but just to meet the needs that you have, but making sure you are getting in starchy, fibrous plants and or fruits, vegetables, and including that in there to make sure you eat big enough meals. I know that I eat these big, huge, ginormous salads when I'm training for races or events, and some people will be like, how do you eat all that on top of everything else you're eating or whatever it is? But I'm that hungry. I am starving. I am ravenous, and it does help me meet my nutritional needs, my fiber needs, but also keeping me full. And again, this isn't me saying like, oh, try to keep yourself full and fill yourself up with vegetables so that you don't overeat or anything like that. It's that like, no, your hunger is going to be higher and your body's just going to be metabolizing more food as your needs increase, especially if you have higher training goals. You can't just like willy-nilly fill your entire diet with like calorically dense, low volume foods. You're probably going to still have to eat very filling, satisfying, and well-made meals in order to not only meet your nutritional needs, but also keeping you full and satisfied between meals or for your training sessions in general. And there's nothing I hate more than like being hangry for a training session. I've learned that I need way bigger meals to keep me full through training sessions than like just a little tiny thing that I eat because I'm worried that it's going to hurt my stomach. Like making sure I eat enough for those training sessions and making it appropriate for the goal of the day that I have ahead of me. So I hope that helps. Again, I am trying to, talk about these things a little bit more in a way that's nuanced, but also is giving you helpful advice and guidance and maybe helping you think about things a little bit different. My intention with these conversations are never to say you should be restricting, under eating, being on a diet while you're training for a marathon or half marathon or race or whatever it is. Like being thin is the most important thing for running or training. But I think in our day and age, there's so many people who do struggle with fat loss or weight loss or wanting to improve body recomposition and wanting, good evidence-based ways and approaches to to take to that, without, burning the candle at both ends, or under eating, or underperforming because they're not fueling themselves appropriately. So again, go back to listen to my original Performance versus Aesthetic podcast. Do not take this advice as me saying, go on a diet while you're training for a race. Absolutely not. That is not the time to diet. Save that for another time. And if you need more help with this, I'll link my macro calculator in the show notes or YouTube notes here below, as well as I will have my fast and fed mini guide, which is tremendously helpful for you guys of just like setting up your own nutrition and how to approach this and the approach that I take to it with that. And then again, I have no link for it, but I really recommend and like the Macro Factor app. I think it does a great job. It estimates your energy expenditure, versus like if you feel neutral about tracking your body weight. I do this when I'm race training, is I track my body weight versus my energy expenditure. And I know that when I first start race training, I usually drop a little bit of weight. Just my body has like this natural setting point that it goes to when I'm race training versus off season. It's within this 5 to 7 pound range. It's where my body sits naturally. It's not really fighting it or restricting it. But I really try to make sure that like I'm not dropping too far below that. So I use that as a guide for me to kind of look at my weight trends versus my intake. And if I see that it's dropping or my increase in energy expenditures like going up higher, I kind of will bump up my calories in response to that. It's a really great, I think it's a really great algorithm, especially someone who works in and has worked in human metabolism and indirect calorimetry and all that stuff. Really, really like what they have done there. Not paid ad, just personal use of 4 or 5 years now. So I really recommend that app, but there's other ones out there that people like as well, but I just think their AI algorithm is really, really well done in there if you kind of need help with that. So if you guys found this helpful, let me know if you have any questions below, any topics or things you'd like to see in future podcasts and or videos on YouTube here, or, rate and review on your favorite platform. Make sure that you subscribe on YouTube, all of the things above. It really helps support me, the show, the tube, all of the above. And if you found this helpful, share it with friends, share it with someone who needs it. And otherwise, I'll catch you guys on the next episode or video. Thank you for being here.